Today's 21st century Victorian adventure is our second history-bounding capsule wardrobe skirt. This time we're making the McCall's M8071 Angela Clayton skirt pattern. This skirt showed up in my recommended patterns on Etsy and I just fell in love with it, especially the button front details. Then, when I found just enough brown tweed wool on the fashion links table at my local fabric store to make both the skirt and a matching waistcoat, I knew that my #darkacademia history-bounding outfit was meant to be. This pattern is what we call a Big Four pattern because it's made by one of the Big Four pattern companies. These are Butterick's, McCall's, Simplicity, and Vogue. Don't let the different names fool you though, they're actually all owned by the same company. If you are just learning to sew or want a fairly easy make, the Big Four pattern companies can be a great place to start. They assume a pretty minimal level of skill and knowledge for a lot of them, and they have really detailed instruction. This isn't to say they're all beginner level or easy. They also put out patterns for wedding dresses, and American Duchess has worked with Simplicity to create a whole set of patterns for their costumes. So they can be pretty complicated. But for something like the skirt we're making, like I said, it's a pretty easy make, and the instructions and markings are really straightforward. One note about using their historical patterns, should you so choose, they're made to be costumes, and so their focus isn't on historical accuracy. So if historical accuracy and techniques are your jam, they're probably not the right place to go. However, they are still a great place to go if what you want is a historical costume with clear instructions that's been really well pattern tested. If you are fairly new to sewing or costuming, this is likely to be a much more fun place to start than one of the more complicated patterns that assumes a lot of background knowledge and technique. And you are just as much of a historical costumer whether you make your costume from rayon with a Simplicity pattern or from silk with your own pattern drafting. You don't need to be a pattern drafter or use the nicest fabrics or an expert sewist to be a costumer. All you need is a costume. When figuring out which pattern size to buy, completely disregard your usual sizes. Commercial pattern sizing is so much smaller than ready-to-wear fashion, so just go by your measurements. This pattern stops at a 34-inch waist, which is another drawback of the Big Four. They rarely go into plus sizes. For this skirt, because I have a 36-inch waist, I had to grade the pattern up. For my Big Four patterns, especially ones that are hard to replace or I have to grade up, I usually trace the pattern onto paper. I found that this roll of paper was not quite as see-through as I was hoping, so I ended up using a lighted tracing board to trace the pattern out. If you don't have a tracing board, just tape both pieces of paper to a big window or a sliding glass door. Take care when taking them down though. Commercial patterns are printed on this flimsy tissue paper and it tears very easily. Since the difference between sizes on this pattern is 2 inches, meaning that each size jumps 2 inches from the previous one, I only had to grade up one size to go from a 34 to a 36. Pattern pieces have two kinds of sides. One is a solid black line. These lines are the same no matter which size you are making. The multi-size lines, which have different line types like dashed lines or dotted lines, are your sizing lines. You cut these according to your pattern size. To grade up your pattern, trace the solid lines exactly where they are. For the sizing lines, measure the distance between the outermost two lines. This will be between the 32-inch size and the 34-inch size for this. This is the increase needed to go up one size. Now, it won't be consistent all the way around the pattern, so make sure that you're measuring for every pattern piece and at different points along the line and tracing exactly. Now, trace a new line that distance from the size line for the biggest size. This is easy on a skirt because it's largely straight lines and they're at equal distances. But if they are not straight lines or the pattern narrows somewhere or widens, take care to echo that in your new lines. Once you have done that for all of the pattern pieces, you have your new pattern. Also, transfer any markings, make sure to label your pattern pieces. I like to put what pattern they're from and which view I'm making on it too, so that future Frances doesn't have to wonder what past Frances was thinking. It is generally recommended not to grade up more than about 4 or 5 sizes. Patterning is all about balance line, like the waistline. And when a pattern is sized up too much, the proportions can get too stretched to keep the balances line correctly, balanced. So you end up with a wonky waistline or a skirt that isn't the same length all the way around. Now that you have new pattern pieces, it's time to make a mock-up. If you graded the pattern in any way or made other changes, please do not skip this step. This is how you will know that your new pattern pieces actually fit you. For this mock-up, I did the darts, so the sides, and added the waistband. It's got an interesting shape, so I wanted to try that, and adding it affects the stretch of the skirt, so I wanted to check that it still fit with the waistband in. I did make one unnecessary change. I wanted the button placket to fold under completely to hide the raw edge, and I didn't realize until I attached the buttons on the final skirt that the pattern does just that. I just hadn't folded the placket under enough times. I will show you what I mean when we get there, but otherwise I was thrilled with my pattern grading and mock-up and was excited to get started on the skirt. After all of the super slippery silk I've been working with for the tea gown, this wool was a joy. I know it's 100% wool, but I don't know what kind. It feels a bit like a cashmere, but the fabric store doesn't label the fashion links because they are basically remnants. But it's so soft and stable and doesn't slide around while you are working with it. It was lovely. This pattern is also fairly straightforward and well explained, so I'm not going to detail every step. You can follow the instructions. Instead, I'm going to focus on giving pointers, explaining some of the more difficult bits, and giving some tips on how to make it look neater overall. Consider this the list of things I wish I'd thought to do before I finished it. The first step in assembling the skirt is to sew the darts in the front panel. Since I was using wool, I used chalk to make the pattern markings. The chalk did wear off pretty quickly, so I kept the pattern pieces handy in order to add them back as needed. When you make the marks, take care to mark which are the small circles on the pattern and which are the larger circles. You will match small circle to large circle to ensure your pleats fold the correct way. Take care to press your pleats well and then baste in place. This will give you much neater pleats. You're going to top stitch to secure them. Top stitching is one of my favorite little details because it just looks so nice when it's finished. To top stitch, you want to use a shorter stitch length and sew very close to the edge of the pleat on the right side of the fabric. I like to pick one of the little indentations on my presser foot to line the pleat up with, and then follow that all the way down. It helps keep my stitch length consistent. Take your time and pay very close attention to your stitching while you're top stitching. This is going to show from the front side, and so you want it to be neat. The pattern instructions do not tell you how to finish the seams. You can overlock them if you choose, but I made bias tape and did bias bound seam allowances. This pattern also calls for a bias bound hem, so you do have to either make or buy bias tape anyway. Since I wanted enough fabric left over for my matching waistcoat, I decided to use brown cotton broadcloth for the bias tape. I also used this to finish the seams and to make pockets. Where the seams were pressed in one direction and top stitch, I bound both seam allowances at once. Where they were pressed open, I bound them separately. I made my bias tape for seam finishing out of 1-inch strips, but I should have gone a bit wider. I recommend 1 1/4 inch so that you can easily fold your bias tape under on the back. When you sew your bias tape for the seam allowance, line your seam allowance and the bias tape edge up, right sides together. Sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Fold the bias tape over the seam allowance and make sure the bias tape extends past your stitch line on the back. Press and pin. You will now stitch in the ditch from the right side to secure the back. Take care not to sew through the skirt, you're only sewing the seam allowance. On the center back seam, stop when you get to the placket opening in the back. When you are sewing the back panels together, the pattern has you first make the plackets for the closure, then sew up the center back seam. One thing I found confusing, I mentioned this earlier, was the way it tells you to fold over the left back extension. It has you finish the edge, which I did not do because I wanted to encase it in the placket anyway, and then fold it over. You will actually need to fold this extension under twice, both to enclose the raw edge and to make the back lie flat when closed. The right back extension is also folded under twice, then slip stitched in place, but I found these instructions a bit more obvious. After assembling the front and back of the skirt, you will sew them together on the side seams. Despite having the perfect side seams for beautiful, luxurious, deep pockets, this pattern made the unforgivable sin of omitting them entirely. And we certainly could not have that. So before you sew up your side seams, stop and make your pockets. If you've never made a pocket, I've put a link to my pocket tutorial above. However, we will not be felling these pocket seam allowances. We will just catch the seam allowance of the pockets in with the side seam when we do the bias binding. After you've added your pockets, you're ready to sew in the waistband. The points on the bottom edge of the waistband should match up with the front seams on the skirt, so I pinned the waistband in, and then I checked that my points would match before sewing in place. The one thing I wish I'd done at this point was to lay the skirt flat and make sure the two back plackets were going to end up the same length from the top of the waistband to the center back skirt seam. Mine ended up a bit off. You can't tell, but it would have been nice if they hadn't. So pause here and measure these, then adjust your top waistband seam as needed. Also take care to pin the seam allowances in the directions you want them to go when you sew them into the waistband. Sew the waistband in place and press. I do not love using interfacing, so I tend to replace that with a heavyweight muslin or a lightweight canvas in my waistbands. In my experience, the interfacing will lose its stiffness long before the skirt wears out. So just treat your inner lining like another layer of fabric and sew it in as you would the interfacing. When top stitching the lower edge of the waistband down, start by matching your points to your front seams again. Then pin your lower edge out from there. Since you have stay stitched the curves of the waistband, you do not have to worry too much about stretching it out of place, and can play a little bit with easing it to sit flat if needed. Don't go overboard with this, however. You can still stretch the curves out of shape if you're too aggressive. Once again, carefully top stitch down. Remember that this will be front and center, so go slow, take your time, and use a consistent groove on your presser foot. Now add your closure. I had lost all of the chalk marks by this point, so I lined it back up with the pattern and thread marked where my hook and eye and snap should go. To attach both kinds of closures, you will want to use a thread that is doubled over on itself for extra strength and durability. Then use a blanket stitch, also called an applique stitch, to secure all the way around the fastener. I give a tutorial about this in my previous history bounding skirt video. For the snaps, I used 4 to 5 stitches per opening. For the hook and bar, I did enough to work my way around each opening and then did 4 or 5 tacking stitches over the shank of the hook. When sewing closures to a placket, you want to take care only to sew through the inner layer of the fabric so that the securing stitches don't show on the other side of the skirt. Check before and after each closure that they are properly lined up and the placket sits flat when closed. Next, sew on your buttons. Since these are just for detail, you don't have to sew any buttonholes at all, which is really the best news. To sew my buttons on, I again doubled up my thread and sewed several times through the button shank and the fabric. My buttons are directional, so I did take care to check that they were all the right way round before sewing them on. After several passes through the button, I like to wrap the excess thread around my stitches a couple of times to secure it and then tie it off. Here you can knot your thread, then make an additional stitch through the top layer of the fabric and snip the thread. This will bury the tail in the pleat, making the knot a bit more secure. Now all that remains is your bias bound hem. Hang the skirt overnight to let the bias relax before you attach the hem. This way, if it stretches out of shape, you can just even up the bottom without having to rip the hem out or deciding to wear a wonky skirt. To make my bias tape, I made 2-inch wide strips, then sewed them together end to end, and end to end, and end to end. It took a while. After that, I used my bias tape maker to make a 1-inch double fold bias tape. If you do not have a set of bias tape makers, I cannot recommend them highly enough. Without them, making bias tape is an elaborate ironing and folding process at 1/4 inch widths. With them, you just feed the end of your bias strip into the tape maker and pull it through with one hand and follow it with the iron with the other. And voila, bias tape. Sew your bias tape to the bottom edge of the skirt, right sides together. You'll have to unfold it for this. I used one of the lines on my machine to make sure I was sewing the same distance from the bottom all the way around. You want to slip stitch your ends when you get to them, so I waited to secure the last couple of inches where it overlapped, slip stitch those, and then sewed that in place on the machine. After that, fold the bias tape under and press. Now you are going to pin your folded over bias tape to the wrong side of the skirt, making sure it's not visible from the right side. If you need to, kind of zhuzh your bias tape under. Sew the bias tape down from the inside of the skirt, but again, use the bottom edge of the skirt as a reference for your stitch line. This way the hem will be the same width all the way around. It just visually looks neater. And there you are, a beautiful history-bounding dark academia skirt with pockets for snacks, just waiting for its waistcoat soulmate. And don't worry, that's coming. I am quite pleased with this skirt, though my fabric turned out a bit see-through, so now I have designs on a lightweight petticoat to go under it. I just need to decide whether that needs a black lace trim, because why wouldn't it? This was also a fairly quick make, so it's good if you'd like something you can wear in the near term. This pattern has a matching blouse. I haven't decided whether or not to make it yet. It's cute, but I've been told it has dolman sleeves, and if you've never done dolman sleeves, they're quite a challenge to fit, especially if you're full or busted. However, if you would like to see it made, or just want a tutorial on dolman sleeves, let me know in the comments. And with that, my dear viewers, we have come almost to the end of today's missive. But first, what has quickly become my favorite part, the part where I ask you what you're doing. I really love the comments I get with people telling me about the projects they're making. It's so cool, and all of you are so creative. I just find it really inspiring. So, what are you working on? How's it going? And if you want to share pictures with me, my YouTube handle and my Instagram handle are the same. I've also included it down in the description below. I would love to see pictures, and sometimes I post things I'm making or my progress pictures there. And now, we are at the end of the missive. Except for, of course, the bunny footage, because bunnies. So with that, I will bid you adieu. I remain, as ever, your faithful servant and 21st century Victorian, Frances Worthington.